Nagasaki was not supposed to be remembered. It was not the symbol, not the warning, not the example meant for the world. That role was already taken by another city, 3 days earlier. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki was still alive in the most ordinary way a city can be alive. Factory whistles, streetcars rattling, windows open to summer air. Children walking beside adults who believed the war was already ending. Nothing in the sky suggested destiny. Nothing on the ground suggested selection. And yet, far above the clouds, Nagasaki had already been reduced to a backup plan, a second option. A location chosen not because it mattered most, but because it was still there, still visible, still available. History would later remember Nagasaki as the second atomic city. What history rarely explains is how thin the line was between being spared and being erased. This is not a story about a weapon. It is a story about timing, about weather, about fuel gauges and cloud cover, about a city that did nothing wrong, but existed in the wrong place when the world decided that once was not enough. Nagasaki was not on the original list. When planners marked their maps, they circled cities that symbolized industry, morale, and scale. Cities whose destruction would speak loudly. Nagasaki did not speak loudly. It sat between hills, folded inward, its factories scattered, its neighborhoods divided by terrain. Even its harbor curved away from easy sight. To strategists, it was imperfect. To history, it was forgettable. For weeks, Nagasaki remained what it had always been, a working port city shaped by trade, religion, and routine. People worried about air raids, yes, but worry had become a background noise of life, something you lived with, not something you expected to end everything at once. On August 9th, the primary target was somewhere else. That city had a name. That city had already been measured, studied, and prepared for memory. Nagasaki existed only as a contingency, a word at the bottom of a document, a location used if conditions failed. And when clouds covered the primary target, when visibility collapsed, when time and fuel began to argue against hesitation, that contingency quietly became a decision. No sirens announced it. No one in Nagasaki was informed that the world had just shifted its attention. The city continued breathing, unaware that it had been promoted from irrelevant to chosen. Morning in Nagasaki arrived without urgency. The sky was bright but uneven, clouds drifting lazily between hills, the kind of weather that made people pause before deciding whether to carry an umbrella. Air raid sirens had sounded before, too many times. Most ended the same way. Nothing happened. People learned a dangerous habit. Surviving yesterday became proof that tomorrow would be similar. Workers went to factories carved into the slopes. Streetcars ran their routes. Some windows stayed open because August heat made caution feel optional. At 7:50 a.m., an alert sounded. Then it stopped. An all clear followed. The signal meant safety officially. Unofficially, it meant permission to stop worrying. Children stepped outside. Adults resumed tasks they had paused for only minutes. The city relaxed at the exact moment it should not have. Above the clouds, the aircraft circled, burning fuel, waiting for the sky to make a decision first. It did not feel like fate. It felt like delay. And delay has a way of convincing people they are safe. By the time the clouds thinned, Nagasaki had already returned to routine. That was the final mistake. Not strategy, not politics. Routine. The decision was not made on the ground. It was made where no one would ever hear the sound it made. Inside a narrow cockpit, surrounded by instruments, gauges, and numbers that did not care about names of cities. Fuel was running lower than planned. Clouds refused to clear where they were supposed to. Time pressed in a way that left no room for philosophy. There was no debate about right or wrong in that moment, only about options. Return with the mission incomplete, or proceed to the alternative already written on paper. Nagasaki was not argued for. It was simply there. A coordinate that still existed. A city not hidden by cloud. A city that allowed the mission to continue without rewriting orders. The aircraft turned. Not dramatically, not urgently. Just enough to change history. Below, Nagasaki remained unaware that it had just become the answer to a logistical problem. No warning traveled ahead of the decision. No signal reached the streets or the hills. The city was not condemned. It was selected. And selection, when stripped of emotion, is far more dangerous than anger, because it feels reasonable, because it feels clean, because it allows people to say later that there was no other choice. By the time the aircraft aligned with its new destination, the decision was already old. There was nothing left to interrupt it. The sky had cleared just enough, and that was all it took. What followed was not silence. That is the detail most people get wrong. After the moment passed, sound returned. Wind, distant movement, pieces of a city trying to understand what had just interrupted it. Hills that had shaped Nagasaki for centuries now hid parts of what happened and exposed others. Some neighborhoods vanished into stillness. Others remained standing long enough to realize they were alone. Smoke rose, but not like a signal, more like confusion, climbing without direction. People moved without understanding where to go because familiar paths no longer led anywhere familiar. Streets ended too early. Landmarks stopped existing mid-step. Time fractured into before and after, and the after refused to explain itself. There were no words ready for what the city had become. No language for a place that was still geographically there, but functionally erased. And yet, life did not stop immediately. That was the cruelest part. Survivors called out names into spaces that could no longer answer. Others stood still, not injured enough to fall, not whole enough to move. Nagasaki did not end in one instant. It continued, damaged, breathing, remembering what it used to be, only hours earlier. Nagasaki did not disappear. That is why the weight stayed. The city was rebuilt on the same ground, between the same hills, beside the same water that had witnessed everything and changed nothing. New streets followed old paths. New buildings rose where memory resisted being buried. People returned, not because it was easy, but because leaving would have meant letting the decision finish its work. Years passed, then decades. Children were born who did not see the sky that morning, yet learned its shadow without being taught. Monuments appeared, not to explain, but to remind. Nagasaki became careful with words, careful with ceremonies, careful with silence. It did not shout its story. It let visitors feel it instead. Walk long enough and you sense it. Not guilt, not anger, something colder. The awareness that a city once survived because it was overlooked and died because it was noticed at the wrong moment. Nagasaki remains not as a warning, but as proof. Proof that history is sometimes decided not by intention, but by convenience. And that being second does not mean being spared.